Welcome to a podcast.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here chatting with you.
Nice. Now, let me tell you something. This is feels like I am doing a new rock band, and I have to sing in English so I can join to the global market.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there is a some conception here in the Spanish-speaking community that you have to start doing some kind of English stuff and those things because imperialism and all that.
Linguistic
Uh,
imperialism. Yeah, yeah.
but also this is more about oral recovery. There is some stuff that is going through our culture that we are going more out of the middle man. There is many text but also many oralistic things. How do you think that this is true or not?
Yeah, yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I
Mm,
think also um, putting it in English, you're likely to increase the size of your audience at the very least, for better or worse. Yeah.
for better or worse, that's it. And also there is some kind of uh, hay una corriente, there is a group, a guild in speaking English community that I mean the Spanish English community, the Spanish English, because they talk Spanglish, that they appeal to uh, put in a pedestal the language, because
Hmm.
they say no, there is some things that only can be said in Spanish, so there is only some things that can only be said in English. So they appeal to the difference between ser y estar in español,
Hmm.
because that is not the same in other language and all of that stuff. How much do you think that this is true?
Ah. Well, I do think that there's some things that are easier to say in one language than another and come more naturally. I think you can usually articulate something in another language, but less efficiently. So, if I want to explain to you what Schadenfreude means in English, it might take you a paragraph, whereas it's only one word in German. So. But I love mixing languages. I've just been doing German today, so my head is a little bit there rather than Spanish. But I'll try and remember my Spanish. It'll kick in at some point, I hope. But yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, moving forward, there was right now, finally, some critics on your metamodern discourse. And at the first impressions that everybody had was first understand the thing that you were proposing, isn't it? And you were invited to many things that to explain the many topics that you are trying to propose on the humanities, isn't it? I know you are having some critics. Mostly they come from the self-proclaimed postmodernists, isn't it? And well, now you have to respond to the typical accusations of being white men or all that.
Yeah, so I mean, it's true that the group that's been pushing back is exactly the postmodernists, and even people who define themselves as postmodernists. They're otherwise the work has been mostly positively received, and so there've been now I think they're going to be there've been 2 journal roundtables on the book so far, and there are 2 more journal roundtables on the way out. And people always have some little thing that they like to criticize. I think you can't be a scholar today and not come up with something a little bit critical. But
Mm-hmm.
I think the first podcast that was sort of trying to criticize me has dropped. Yeah, and those are right self-defined postmodernists, which is very amusing. Yeah, I find it very amusing for a range of
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah,
So
yeah.
you can continue. You want to say something else?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I argue in the book is that one of the defining features of postmodernism as an academic paradigm is the sign of the negative, is the capacity to continually block attempts to move outside of the horizon of postmodernism by just doubling down on the critique, basically like scornful, negative, you can't, anything new must be wrong kind of. And the little clips that I heard of their podcast totally seems to fit that theory. I mean, they're asking me or claiming that I'm too bold or something like that. You know,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
like as if that's a criticism in and of itself. And so that seemed to fulfill my sense of my description of academics under the sign of the negative. Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's start to debunk this one accusations, isn't it? Well, you are criticized for not being able to define postmodernity accurately, mostly in doxographic terms, because you are an academic and you have to do all your doxographic job. And furthermore, the new hermeneutics that you're proposing are seen as an akin of a new end of history, positioning yourself as the final link in the historical chain. And so, even more than postmodern, than your predecessors, as you are claiming, no? I'm even more postmodern. And so I am most close to the end of history. In a Hegelian style, it seems that you're in the new turn path, a new element to the discourse you're adding. There are also concerns about the new type of deconstruction that you propose, that you call the anarchist cookbook deconstruction, that some they say that you're differing significantly from Derrida's approach that I focus on the text, on the difference, and the authorship. That all. How do you respond to these criticisms?
So the first criticism, which is that I haven't sufficiently defined postmodernism, is one that I anticipated and actually spend a lot of time going through in the book. And I'll just put this. I apologize for putting this in sort of slightly simplistically, but I think for some reason my critics seem to have missed this. But so I argue that postmodernism is an academic paradigm. And that notion of paradigm obviously comes from Thomas Kuhn, who described a series of scientific paradigms. And the thing that maybe people who haven't read Kuhn very well, the mistake that they often make is that they think that those paradigms were, I don't know, vague and floating in the air, or maybe there's some kind of generic worldview or something like that. But Kuhn very specifically suggests that things like textbooks and common problem sets are the vectors through which paradigms take dominance in certain fields. So, for instance, most physicists who were themselves Newtonians didn't read everything that Newton wrote, but read a few snippets of Newton anthologized in particular texts. And it turns out that those of us who were trained in the academy, many of us, at least since basically the 90s in through the early 2000s, were trained in something called postmodernism. And it was a fabrication insofar as it was made in textbooks. And so it was pieced together in textbooks and in anthologies. And it was, the most popular 5, pieces of Derrida and the 3 popular pieces of Foucault and one thing by Baudrillard or whatever, mashed together as if those people didn't hate each other at times and didn't have a very different and dissonant systems. And in particular, also, it's this image of postmodernism, the reality of the image, that shapes what scholarship often looks like. So, if you want to know, so many scholars call themselves genealogists after Foucault, and they use that term very sloppily to do things that Foucault would not have described as genealogy, for instance. Or they might even use something, lifted totally, they use a lot of stuff totally lifted out of context. It's been Americanized and even re-imported in that way. And there's actually been a lot of scholarship about this. So I'm not the first person to say this. We might think about, books about, I don't have my bibliography in front of me, but things like François Cusset's French Theory, which is he's a French historian of education, and he traces the Americanization and reimportation of French theory. Or there's a German scholar named Angermüller who notes that a lot of French philosophers got big in the United States before they got big in France, and got big in France because of their American reputation. So when I'm talking about, and so there are 2 points I want to make. First, when I'm talking about postmodernism as a paradigm, I mean something very specific in that technical sense. And second, it's not identical to the thinking of any given canonical postmodern quote unquote figure. And I try and be very careful in the book. So when I say, Foucault said this about skepticism, but his followers say that he said that about skepticism. Foucault never said knowledge is power. He was really mad at people who said, but people who think that they're Foucauldians say that. Or Derrida, in his Lettre à une amie japonaise, rejects the idea that deconstruction is a method. And he's like, and he says, it's not a method, you can't copy it. But everybody copies it and tries to do deconstruction. And so there's a lot of similarities that those people, American scholars who are doing deconstruction, for instance, share a lot. And they share a lot with each other. And if you attack them, if you try to attack Derrida, it's often irrelevant to what they're doing, whether you. In that respect, I decided, to put it in different terms. You can't overcome American deconstruction by criticizing what Derrida does, because that's not what most American scholars have been doing. So I wanted to overcome it from the center. And then the other little piece I'll add is, I'm also not an anti-postmodernist. I think that postmodernism was wonderful for what it was. It's just started delivering diminishing returns. And so, it's not like Jordan Peterson or somebody who just uses postmodernism as a strong man and he doesn't know what he's talking about. I spent my time in the trenches learning and working through that stuff, and I find a lot of it valuable in various ways. It's just, it's where theory was at in the 80s. I mean, and I know 80s retro was cool in certain ways, and we all either don't like or like Stranger Things or whatever, but where the philosophical terrain has really shifted since then. And so it's a matter of figuring out what bits of postmodernism to consolidate. So for all those reasons, I was trying to be very careful. My footnotes, I don't think that the dudes criticizing me looked at my footnotes, but I'm quite careful about what I'm getting from where. And then the final piece is, the project I'm arguing for, it doesn't matter what postmodernism was. So the metamodernism stands on what I, for better or worse, call metamodernism. It doesn't even matter if I'm wrong about postmodernism, because I try and argue for it imminently, basically in terms of arguments, rather than based on authority figures. So I'm not saying, like, believe this because Baudrillard said it was true. I'm saying, here's a bunch of arguments for this. And I do cite influences in the scholars that I read, but I'm not arguing on their names, doing a kind of authoritarianism. So yeah, that would be my response. I'm sorry, you're ready to go with the next question. Yeah.
Let's keep digging in that point, because let me hear more about why do you think that the type of deconstruction that you are compelling in your book doesn't have to be with Derrida, and why? Where was the point where the deconstruction of Derrida diverged from the new books that are all the time destroying categories and all that?
So yeah, great question. So, I mean, I think Derrida was doing something very specific in terms of a style of immanent text reading, and it was something that he did also. His main job in France was to prepare students to pass a kind of exam that involved closely reading a text and trying to analyze it for its assumptions and basically kind of knock it down. And he was, very good at a particular kind of set of moves, let's say. But even then he didn't use, and so he claims he gets the word deconstruction from Heidegger's destruction, although it's clearly not at all the same thing that Heidegger was doing. But Derrida also didn't want it to be a method or model. And I think part of it is, what happens in the United States, however, is that word deconstruction takes on its own half-life. It even becomes like a movie in the I think a fairly terrible Woody Allen movie called Deconstructing Harry, for instance. But also, like, already by the 1970s, so in the 1972, I think, by the very, Derrida is just getting introduced in the U.S. in '68, and then by '72, deconstruction has taken off as an American idiom. There's a great book by a scholar whose last name is Jones-Katz, Deconstruction, something, and then I forget the subhead, but it's about the American formulation of deconstruction at Yale, which is where people like Paul Demant, who grabbed control of the word, and where a whole bunch of people associated with what was then called New Criticism started using the term deconstruction in a very expansive way to describe, a kind of broad attempt to demolish or knock down certain conceptual categories. Sometimes they did more or less close text reading. That was part of their thing. But already by like 72, the word has left any kind of plausibly Derridian technical usage. And then when Derrida comes to the US himself, he says, deconstruction is America. And so he seems to have been interested in the play of that word and its expansive usages. I think he was also annoyed about it a little bit too. And he often said he didn't mean it to be the technical term that described his whole oeuvre. So, but the deconstructive, so I think it's no longer a technical term. So I'm not using it when I use deconstruction to describe a set of epistemological anarchist practices. I include Derridian deconstruction among them, but I also include a vaster array of more different ways of knocking down concepts, including things that we might associate with a Foucauldian lineage, although that was often mashed up with Derrida, or stuff that actually goes back to Wittgenstein. So a bunch of what some scholars say, or some scholars who claim to be doing deconstruction are basically adopting a model that late Wittgenstein used to break, say, the category of games down. And so there's so I think it's just, Derrida scholars might want to hold on to it as something that exclusively Derrida did, maybe, but I think that the ship has sailed on that one. So I'm not doing just a Derridian textual interpretation, although that's included. But I'm not breaking from, people were using this term in this way before I was born. So I don't think you can say that I've invented some kind of new bastardization of the term deconstruction.
Yeah. Well, another point that is important about the hermeneutics that you are trying to trigger is they suspect that they are attached to some crypto-religious, crypto-spiritual thing, because you are appealing to some Buddhism and some Nahuatl stuff, isn't it? And you have been criticized in a manner akin to the Byzantine philosopher Platon for being a syncretist who aimed to introduce Orientalist ideas into the West. This is not merely about bringing Eastern concepts to Western thought, but rather creating a simulation of Western spirituality and religion within the humanities. Concepts as, the Teotl and the Buddhism Madhyamaka philosophy, and also some certain Platonic ideas like transcendental categories that they are accusing you are using. So all this is crafted to influence young adults who are particularly susceptible to the new narratives, isn't it? And essentially, well, in short terms, in postmodern deconstructive terms, you're being accused of being a Western white man who is appropriating Eastern culture and philosophy, thereby stripping essential identity from Eastern rights. How do you respond to this accusation? I hope you can debunk point by point this stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, in the first case, I grew up with Buddhism, so it's not something that I appropriated, but something I inherited from my family. I think there's also a tendency to, I'm mixed race, so my heritage is complicated and messy, but I'm definitely white passing. So race is such a complicated mess in America, and but I wouldn't identify as a white man particularly, although I'd say I'm white passing, and I have some white heritage. I think also, I think that the more fundamental question is around the way that philosophy defends itself from, or defends its Eurocentrism by accusing anything that it doesn't fit in the Western philosophical canon of being religious or covertly religious, and therefore illegitimate. And so, one of the, I think Boaventura de Sousa Santos, talks about the cosmopolitan ecology of knowledges, or we can talk about Mignolo's notion of the Western code. But there's this is something that's pissed me off from the very beginning of my undergraduate, when I would start taking courses on East Asian philosophical thought. They would be located in a religion department instead of in a philosophy department, and they would be sidelined and treated as secondary. And
you know what? Yeah. They're also accusing that the religious humanities are the lowest of the lowest, isn't it?
And I don't know why. Yeah, they may say that, and that just sounds like total random bullshit. I mean, I don't think that I'm against all the disciplinary silos. So, I don't think, but also anybody who's selling you a hierarchy of academic disciplines is in the humanities is just trying to advance themselves. So I would say in the first instance that this is an incredibly Eurocentric critique that is an attempt to block out the whole decolonial method. Yeah, it makes me mad, actually.
Ironically coming from the self-postmodernist, isn't it?
Yeah. It's definitely, I know, it seems ironical, exactly. But I think, now, to be clear, there are some metamodernists who have religious projects, but I'm not one of them, at the very least. So, my friend and colleague Brendan Dempsey, he's got his own a project that perhaps has a more theological side to it, but that's not mine. So I'll put that there. Yeah. So for me, I think it's very much a decolonial project, and so
See, because they're also accusing some, not only you, many scholars that are doing the colonial methods of the construction through religious and all the esoteric stuff of Western esotericism that comes from the Amsterdam University, the Embassy of Free Mind, and all that stuff. And I can see some, I don't know, some correlation, some kind of thinking that they are trying to do a critique to the modern paradigm, appealing to the esoteric, the cult, and the religion, to the Orient also. And they are accusing all these academics that they are secretly being esoteric and secretly being superstitious and secretly being in the path of the New Age stuff and all of that. Do you consider yourself? Because I have to admit that I discovered you mostly from the second book that you write, the Myth of Disenchantment, and there you were trying to debunk all that stuff that we here in Occident, we are in Western part of the world, we are more rationalist, and Orient are more magical. And this is something that has been around since the Renaissance. And well, I don't think that it isn't. Well, that discussion will be for another moment. But how do you think about these questions that you are trying to be esoteric secretly? And do you secretly believe in God also?
And do I secretly believe in what?
In God.
In Goth or God?
God. In God.
So I'm definitely not a theist. And although I did, my second book is The Myth of Disenchantment, is a sort of about the history of Western esotericism and the idea that, and the weird claim that Europe is rational and the rest of the world superstitious, that I was trying to debunk. But just because I've historically studied that doesn't mean that I'm part of that. Just the way that a sociologist of poverty is unlikely to be actually poor themselves. There are some scholars of esotericism, of quote unquote Western esotericism, who are themselves esotericists. That's definitely true. And actually, one of the things I want to stick up for is ontological plurality. And I think one of the things that I think is cool is that people have their own theologies and they have their own ethical systems. So, even if I'm not a Western esotericist, if they're Western esotericists, if they're scientific materialists, if they're theologians, if they're people who practice the traditional Nahuatl folkways, or what have you, who are participating in our collective conversation, I think that it's part of a decolonial mission that we have to accept them. And in fact, I make the case for a kind of meta-ontology that includes a range of possible ontologies, not all of them, because some of them make language not work. But basically, I try and argue for a kind of openness there. So in that respect, if we're committed to a kind of intellectual pluralism and we're not really like cowards about it, then it's okay if people have their own personal projects. And so, and I think, so again, this seems like another sign of the negative, right? Which is an attempt to, accuse everybody of having values, and then you challenge them. You don't see that your own values are values because they're negative. they're skeptics, and they don't think that any belief is for them a violation of their skepticism, but they don't realize that their skepticism is dogmatically held. And so, but yeah, I want to pluralize our ontologies. I don't want to be an ontological imperialist in that particular way.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
but they accuse that you're causing some kind of simulation of the truth identity of these philosophies, and so this is ironic and very contradictory, because the postmodernists usually say that there is no essential things on the things, and they, in some contradictory way, adopt the idea of Baudrillard, that simulation, and they use it in a very, I don't know, anarchist, way to apply into many things. So they accuse, of this is simulation, this other is simulation, this other is modernidad líquida. How is it?
Liquid
How is
modernity.
it? Yeah, and they use those terms in a very arbitrary way. And so they accusing you that you are creating a simulation of, for example, the Nahua philosophy. And the Buddhist philosophy, and you're depriving it from their rights, from their authenticity. And also, this can be said from the Hermetic esoteric path of the Native American, North American tribes, and the philosophies from the Orient, such as Confucianism, the Tao, and all that. So, how much of this is true? I mean, can you actually deprive from their authenticity these philosophies?
Right. I think you're right that you can't, right? I mean, well, you could if you were merely appropriating the name and then claiming to be the real version of it. So, I mean, there's a lot of like cruddy stuff out there in the popular culture, for instance, that claims to be feng shui or something, and the people involved have never studied anything in China or whatever. But I don't think that that using ideas from a wide range of philosophical traditions is in any way depriving them. So I would totally grant that. But I wanted to also touch back on your earlier point that they've taken Baudrillard and they've kind of Americanized Baudrillard, it sounds like, and then they're using it. And that's exactly tucks back to my first critique, which is that it's not primarily the individual thinkers like Derrida and Baudrillard and Foucault who are the sources of quote unquote postmodernism, but their American reception. I don't think Baudrillard would be policing the essential categories of people's thought when he was, I'm not a deeply Baudrillardian thinker, but his notion of the simulacra is not an attempt to get back to a real in that respect, or to re-essentialize everything, particularly in racial, cultural ways. So yeah, and I also think it's vitally important that we keep world philosophical traditions around. And I think this is also further evidence for the kind of Eurocentrism behind a lot of the postmodernism discourse. It's why people in a lot of parts of the world were unclear whether the term postmodernism applied to them or not. It was supposed to be a grand periodizing term. And then, even people like Cornel West were like, black folk in the contemporary US don't fit in this postmodern zeitgeist, at least except for those at elite institutions. So, yeah, and I think that whole line of critique is also, it's ironic. Yeah.
Yeah, and we also have this kind of stuff, this kind of critique here in Mexico with all the Nahua and the native people here in Mexico, that white people from the cities and white people from the Europe and North America, they are appropriating the philosophy, their style of life, and they are rebranding in a consumist way. And I mean, this kind of lifestyle, of philosophy, of way of thinking that is globalizing and mixing together with other superior cultures, how they secretly think, I think, because they see the cultural appropriation only happening through the one that has the power to the one that doesn't. So this can be possible. Can you redefine what cultural appropriation mean in the original term, or if it is even legitimate, a legitimate, un concepto legítimo.
Yeah, a legitimate conceptual category. Yeah, I mean, so I think that I don't think it's a very legitimate conceptual category, and here's why. So first off, in its original usage, as I understand it, the word cultural appropriation was a positive term, and it described what minoritized groups did to re-signify the meaning of terms in dominant cultures. So when, for instance, practitioners of Voodoo would take the images of saints, of Catholic saints, but treat them as the images of Orisha, of like African and Yoruba gods, for instance. So, but then the term cultural appropriation became a negative term, and then the problem is that on the one hand, I'm happy to, I want to be clear to criticize commodification. So when you're taking something from some group and you're commodifying it and trying to make money off of it, that sucks. But the idea that you can steal culture is a neoliberal metaphor. It's a capitalist metaphor. It's like, don't steal culture, don't steal cars. But the other problem is that a lot of the cultures are flow, and they don't originate in the context that people would like them to originate in. For instance, if you look at the original writings of the Rastafari who popularized dreadlocks, they were referencing the biblical figure of Samuel and the idea that it was the Hebrews who had a particular kind of hairstyle. And now later, there were connections between that hairstyle and something that happened in Africa. But I would not encourage anyone to go up to a Rasta and accuse them of cultural appropriation. So, but instead, so it seems to me that the notion of cultural appropriation is often used to, with a lack of awareness of the cultural flows that are always happening. I would still get pissed off if somebody was taking something that was meaningful to me and treating it in a cruddy way. And, racist Halloween costumes are still racist or whatever. Like, that's not the same issue. But also the policing of cultural appropriation sometimes works to deprive minoritized artists of their cultural products as well. So, for instance, like the idea that that I remember, that if you like hip hop and you're not black, that you're culturally appropriating. But I think a lot of black hip hop artists would love people to buy hip hop, regardless of their racial background. So I think mostly it's just, there are a lot of cultural flows, and I think we should be fair to criticize superficial uses of symbols that people don't understand. So if you're just sticking a bindi on your forehead because it looks cool without any awareness of how people in a particular community are reading it, then there might be reasons to criticize the person. And I think we also want to criticize commodification regardless of the racial or cultural background of the person commodifying it. So if somebody is making cheap plastic crap that looks like, I don't know, something that would be, sacred to a particular indigenous community, it doesn't matter whether that person was born in that community, I think, or whether they were born outside that community. The fact that people in that community are having their creative work commodified, is obviously might piss them off. And if it does, then you have to reckon with that. But none of this fits into the broader notion of something called cultural appropriation. And, and I think you're also right that there are presumptions about hierarchies between cultures and presumptions that then end up policing and reaffirming racial categories. So if you want to say you can't be influenced by Nahuatl thought if you're not Nahuatl ancestry, then what you're actually doing is you're actually preventing people from a Nahuatl background having influence for those categories from decolonizing the globe. And so I think that it's hard to have a decolonial agenda and police cultural appropriation in the same way. And cultural appropriation, it's basically a neoliberal thing. It's something that's like center-left that people, it ignores elite capture, which is also, a look at, if your listeners might want to read Olufemi Taiwo's book on elite capture, but it basically, there are people, who can get rich off of things who are from a particular community in ways that are either helpful or harmful to that community. And so just because, they have a certain background doesn't mean that what they're doing is good for the community that they come out of. There are, black Republicans, for instance, who might exploit the community that they came from. So, I think we have to be more grown up about it than the whole thing. And the critique of cultural appropriation is just not a good one. Yeah.
and let me tell you that that's a very American thing to do, because here in Latin America we have another type of racism. Um, in the US, I have observed, and some say also that America racism is pointed out to segregation. So they try to uh, exalt their own identity.
Yeah.
While in here in Latin America, the methods of colonization and racial thought was that homogenization. That if you no, doesn't matter if you are like brown or or black. The thing is that you have to scale in the race. So you have to clean the race, be more white, be more close to the Spanish, so you can have more noble titles. And this is some contradictory, uh, a clash of racial thought here in the Spanish community and the English community, because we're because we are submitted to the English speaking Anglophone sphere of imperialism. More and more here in the Spanish community, we are being subjected to this kind of hermeneutics to the racial thought, because we are not responding to that. And I don't know, this is
Yeah. No, and
something very Americanized.
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. The critique of culture appropriation can function as a kind of segregation, that racial segregation that happens often by the left and right in the contemporary U.S., at least covertly. And it's also true that a lot of people from cultures outside of the U.S. don't believe in cultural appropriation. There was a controversy, for instance, at a museum near me when I was in the U.S., where the Boston Museum of Art, where they were a Japanese exhibit having people try on kimonos, and a bunch of as far as I understood them, a lot of them were, some of the people who were protesting were Asian American, but not Japanese American. And they were pissed off that there were white people wearing kimonos. But the Japanese embassy said, no, why would wearing kimonos be cultural appropriation? This is clothes. And we, the Japanese embassy, want to promote Japanese culture. And the more people who wear kimonos, the better. But I hope that the rest of the globe doesn't internalize this weird, basically kind of racial policing that goes on in terms of the language of cultural appropriation. We also do want to be sensitive to people. And yeah, again, I'll say it again, no racist Halloween costumes. So, blackface is never cool. Blackface is just racist. It's not because it's cultural appropriation that makes blackface racist. That's, something else.
See.
But yeah.
Well, let's abandon this topic of cultural appropriation. Let's go through another topic that goes through your accusation of Platonism, because you seem to suggest that there exists certain forms within existence that regulates entropy and unfolding. Well, while acknowledging the flux of the terrestrial in Platonic sense, you appear to believe in certain axioms that govern all existence subjected to this unfolding. Do you truly believe in transcendental categories? If so, do you propose these actions within the context of the social kinds and natural kinds you discuss? Because you elaborate on the nature of this action. Can you elaborate on the nature of these actions? Because they seem that these actions that you're proposing inside the social kinds and the natural kinds are appealing to the transcendental categories in the Platonic sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought I don't think of myself as a Platonist in any way, because I don't think of anything. I definitely don't have a hierarchy of forms or an idea that there's something kind of eternal. I think of it as transcendental, perhaps more Kantian sense, and that's more explicit in my meta-ontology, which is to say, if there are creatures in the world such that we're capable of crudely navigating the world without things in the world suddenly turning into, I don't know, sheep or something like that, or falling off the world or something, then the world must have at least a limited amount of regularity to it. I probably put this a little bit better. I mean, I hope I put this a little better in the book. I'm a little tired now, but I would say, that's the close. It's modeled on Kant, definitely not on Plato, and it's just a very basic way to talk about the kind of world in which meaning appears. Because it turns out if you can even say a little bit about the kind of world in which meanings appear, in which there are entities that are capable of perceiving their environment, then you can actually leverage up something really huge, which is a whole full-blown philosophy of language. And you don't even have to say that much about the world, but that it's clumpy. It has to have some kinds of relative moments of stability built in it. And so if you, if you grant that there are, that trees, or the world doesn't, the patterns of the world don't suddenly change in irrevocable ways, such that we can't comprehend them, then we can start to think about how perception works. But I do mention natural kinds in the book as a hedge, because I'm debating with a philosophy of science literature, but I'm definitely not trying, for which the notion of natural kinds is ubiquitous. And philosophers of science have convinced me, perhaps, maybe, that atomic elements might be natural kinds in the way that that term is usually defined, insofar as that they seem to have essences that properties in view of the fact that they have essences and that they're definable according to rigid definition in a particular way. Like basically, like you can know gold when you find gold in theory, and it should have properties of gold in all universes in which there are gold. That may be the case. And I have that as a hedge. I say, even in the book, there may be natural kinds like gold. But otherwise, I try not to create a binary. So there might be a latent binary, but I don't mean it very seriously, especially in that I don't think that the social is fluid and moving and the natural is unchanging. Rather, I think of the cosmos in terms of processes, unfolding processes at different kinds of speeds. So there are things that change in the lifespan of an individual, like cultural categories, words and their meaning, or institutions or political systems or what have you. And there are things that change in the span of, 50 or 100 years. And there are things that change in the span of 1,000 years. Or there's like vast evolutionary time, or, there's the evolution of stars, and then there's the evolution of the cosmos. And all of those things I think of as unfolding processes. And so, and I don't think my notion of social kinds is built to include other kinds of social creatures. So I include, bee hives and the communication strategies that chimpanzees use, and a whole bunch of other things in my account of social kinds. But I think you're probably right that insofar as I'm building my social kinds in contrast to what philosophers of science call natural kinds, that there may be an implicit binary that we need to make sure that we're capable of deconstructing, that we don't reify, because otherwise we'll end up with a dualism. And I definitely think that would be a mistake.
Yeah. So can you reframe in more detail why we need this natural kind? Because as you have said, the natural kinds are also subjected to the same social kinds that you're proposing. So in which sense social kinds are influenced by natural kinds, and natural kinds are some kind of social kinds also? So can you reframe more of that?
Yeah, so I would say that basically the only reason, I only provide one example of a possible natural kind, and that's atomic elements. If we bracket that out of the question, and I'm not a chemist enough to be able to, but then there's nothing that fully qualifies as a natural kind. So let me put it in a different way. I do think that there are, when I define social kinds, I'm interested in socially constructed kinds. And I think that there's some things that are not socially constructed, but those things that are not socially constructed, so this is a double negative, I don't think are necessarily not. I think that those are unfolding, they're flowing, they have messy edges. And I don't think that nature is not socially constructed, but rather the line between nature and culture is itself one of those things that is socially constructed. And then I also want to say that I don't think that social kinds are socially constructed means unreal. So really, as I give the example in the book, a car is socially constructed, but it can still run you over. So what does it mean for something to be socially constructed? Well, what I mean is, and this is where I theorize mind dependency, I mean that that by the social, and I talk about this also in an earlier chapter, that it's mind dependent in some particular way, but that could be mind dependent because it was produced by a mind, like a mind brought into being, or it could be mind dependent because someone's thinking it in their head, or it could be mind dependent because a mind is categorized in a particular way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I go into a long typology of this. And I also don't just include humans in the category of things with minds, but include any kind of sentient creature that's navigating its environment and producing other kinds of kinds. So that includes, social animals and social insects. So I'm definitely not trying to reify a social versus natural distinction that includes the presumes nature is eternal and unchanging. But I don't think that, there are questions about how our social kinds apply to things in the world. So a scientific category is definitely a social kind. Is the thing to which the scientific category itself applies merely a product of that social classification, or is it something that is a product of the world? I think we have to be very careful, and we can do it on a case-by-case basis. And it's not us philosophers that are making that distinction often, but physicists, because that's exactly the central question in physics. Are quarks a thing that are just a product of the classificatory structure of physics, or are quarks a thing in the world? And are quarks emerge something only out of mental interaction? In other words, some radical Copenhagen interpretation folks think that that's the case. Maybe, maybe not. I don't want to, again, I want to recognize the limits of my own capacity to do physics. But hopefully that won't be held against me. But all that is to say, I think that that the way that the opposition between social and natural is usually articulated is completely wrong. I agree with Bruno Latour there. And if there's a vestigial alternative to social kinds in my thing, I think that I'm just not exploring how the mechanisms that cause all the things in the world to have all the properties that I do. But I would note that if you drop that qualifier of, so I have that definition of social kinds, or description of social kinds, which where I say socially constructed, and then a bunch of stuff about anchoring processes. If you drop the word socially constructed, let me just get it. I'll just get it from my own. I'll just get the definition because I've been playing with it so long okay.
Let me hear it.
Let me see. When did I last tell someone about it? I'll have to open up my.
We have time. Don't worry. I can cut out.
So here we. Social kinds are socially constructed dynamic clusters of powers which are demarcated by the processes that anchor the relevant clusters. I think that if we drop that first, so the definition has three parts: socially constructed dynamic clusters of powers which are demarcated by the processes that anchor, and in this case, cause the clustering, basically. I think that if you drop the word socially constructed, much of what we think of as the non-human world, that, if we're, stars or whatever, stars are also anchored, are also demarcated by the processes that cause them to share the relevant clusters. And I also think, you could build a whole process ontology out of this. But in the that's probably what I would have to say. But I think you're right. I think the criticism that's right. Or sorry,
the conflict basically it's about how do you construct human discipline. That was, I think, that was you trying to resolve, not only the reality itself. I mean.
Totally. I'm trying to figure out how do you construct a humanistic discipline, exactly. And so social kinds theory is for me an attempt to do something that's that treats the categories that we use in our analysis, and then also to, in a way, de-anthropomorphize the humanistic discipline that I'm also trying to work through, and just note that we're also social animals, and so we share things, including constructing kinds with other kinds of social creatures. Definitely.
But there becomes another problem inside, also in the hylosemitic theory that you're developing, because you previously said that the sentient beings also construct these social kinds, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
That's right.
But you're also proposing that these sentient beings are also semiotic beings. But this is kind of problematic, because maybe the machines are semiotic, maybe the machines are sentient, the computers are sentient. So how we divide this path? Because also this projects itself to ethical problems, because if we consider the sentient beings and semiotic beings as computers, or as some kind of animals, or some kind of, even, I don't know what will come in the future, but this will develop some ethical problems and some conceptual problems inside, mainly in the EI.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great area, and I actually got approached recently by a computer science guy who wants me to talk more about it. And confess I have more thinking to do about it myself. I do think that that it's important that so a semiotic being would be, a sentient being for me is a semiotic being. It's a being that's processing its environment in terms of symbols, basically, or in terms of perceptions or signs. And I think that there's a huge amount of the world that is semiotic, because it turns out, we're not the only creatures that perceive the world in terms of carriers of meaningful significance. As Uxkal argued about a million years ago, ticks perceive the world in terms of carriers of meaning. There's a good question about what it implies for computers, and especially one of the things that it seems to suggest is that that there are ways in which once something becomes sufficiently artificially intelligent as to be able to interpret perception, to perceive things, then it is a kind of sentient being, definitely, and that it will tend to produce different kinds of categories through which it perceives its experience. It'll have its own, conceptual ontology. I don't have a strong answer to what to do about AI, and I do think I know it's a problem. Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, and we're seeing it more now, even than in the. I only wrote that book. That book only came out a couple of years ago, and I think it came out a year after I finished writing it, because that's how slow academic publishing is. But even in the last couple of years, the prominence of artificial intelligence has just really leaped to the surface. So I think it's something we're really grappling with and have to grapple with right now, even more so. Yeah.
Yeah, so to finally end this talk, I wanted to recommend some books or music or magazines that you're indulging into.
Okay, let's see. Books, music, or magazines? Oh man. Let's see. Let me think about that for a second. So for your so much. Let me have another moment where you.
That's the problem of having ADHD, and being a coffee morning person. you cannot kind of structure your.
Yeah, so I would say there's actually a Mexican band I've been listening to lately, La Banda Son Imaginaire. Their name is French, so I'm not sure if to pronounce them in a Spanish way or in a French way. But they have an album, La Muerta en Vintage, which also again is mixing and then a great album, another great track called Mexican Wave, and they're doing like goth music. So it really reminds me of when I was I was in the goth music scene for a while, and there's a way in which goth has died in North America, but it seems like Mexico, maybe Germany, other interesting places are keeping it alive, and they're La Banda Son Imaginaire are really good.
And let me tell you that the here in Mexico we are developing some Mexican goth, because we have secretly been goth all the time, the Dia de Muertos and all the stuff, and the La Santa Muerte. So we're pretty goth inside.
I love it, and I love I love Mexican goth stuff, and I love Latin American goth stuff in general. So if you come across stuff, I've got a whole playlist, and I've had friends add other things to it. But I also listen to a bunch of hip hop. The hip hop artist that I probably listen to most is Saul Williams. If your listeners are interested in hip hop, stuff I could go on about music for a really long time, but I've been a big Fredia, I think, I forget how to pronounce her name. Also, there's a good track by Elohim and Big Fredia called Strut, which I've been listening to just today, actually, so I haven't really dug deep, but that's a fun track. But I listen to a lot of old punk rock stuff. I mean, pretty much the whole spectrum. I used to have a radio show, DJ Jason Danger's Transnational Underground, where each week I would play music on a theme, and it was the tagline of my show is world music with an edge, but I would do like a theme, so it would be, I don't know, all the music of Thailand, or it would be like international rockabilly, or it would take like a poetic phrase like Get Back Satan or whatever, and then I'd all play songs that had that kind of language in it. But I spend a lot of time listening to music. I write and exercise often to music. In terms of fiction, I have other stuff, or in terms of, or is that enough? Do we want to end on music?
If you wanted to say it, bro.
Yeah. Well, so again, I'll mention a Mexican or a Latin American writer first. Not Mexican, but Latin American, Roberto Bolaño, who, I'm sure your listeners know, but if they don't know, should definitely, go read. And then in terms of but that's old for me. I've been reading that for a while. What I just finished reading, because I'm in Germany, I'm reading German stuff written in German. I just finished a book by a guy named Friedrich Dürrenmatt. And the title, if I translate the title of it into English, it's been translated into English. The book is published in English with the title "The Pledge: Requiem for the Detective Novel," and it's a short, fun kind of anti-detective novel, which I enjoyed. It's not maybe high literature, but it's just the last fun thing that I read. If I could keep going. I have a whole file full of fiction. I read every night. I also read very quickly, so it helps. But the other novel that I read recently that I really liked was Walter Mosley.
I have heard also that do you read 100 pages in an hour? Is it true that?
Yeah, I read 100 pages an hour in English. I read slower in other languages. I read 10 languages total, but I read 100 pages an hour in English. Actually, it's interesting because I think I was originally dyslexic. So when I learned to read a little bit late, but I adopted a set of reading techniques that turn out to then ended up making me a very fast reader rather than a very slow reader. So I don't really see the words. I don't subvocalize. I often use a pen or a sheet of paper to keep my eyes from wandering while I'm reading the page. And so I've later learned that those were speed reading techniques, and I might have had a teacher help me with at least one of those when I was little. But now I just read very, very quickly in English. It's slower in all my other languages, obviously, but my default English reading speed is pretty fast. Yeah.
Well, and a movie to finish these recommendations? A movie or series? Something visual?
Yeah, something visual. I haven't been keeping up with contemporary movies so much because I feel like they're all superheroes and I just burned out on superheroes. Or they're very much Oscar bait sentimental things. But I do, but that we are living in an interesting age in the history of television. But let me think about what I've been enjoying on television lately. What was the last really good television thing? I mean, I'm right now watching television stuff that's really cheesy. I'm watching Star Trek Discovery. But I can only recommend it because I have a soft spot for Star Trek from my childhood. And even though Discovery is a little bit unusual for Star Trek, it fits in the Star Trek paradigm. But I wouldn't call that high art. I think but it's fun. I think in terms of more high power stuff, there is Breaking Bad. I think everybody's already heard this. Has already had it recommended to them. What stuff is more recent? There's a British series called Guilt. I think it's a Scottish series. There have been a couple series with the title of it. There's a Scottish drama called Guilt, which is also fascinating for people who like things that are tipping into noir. I also love weird, sort of David Lynch-ish things. So the television series that had the biggest impact on me was David Lynch's original Twin Peaks. And I loved a lot of early David Lynch movies. So
Twin Peaks also.
Twin Peaks and stuff like that. I think when I tell people what my favorite, most impactful television series of all time are, I would have to go number 1, Twin Peaks, number 2, The Wire, because that was the other one that really blew me away. So if you're if you want something with real staying power, those are two things. I guess I'm rambling here. I was trying to see if I could think of a telenovela, teledrama, Mexican, Spanish, Latin American teledrama, but I haven't seen many recently that I've really liked. I
Okay.
liked some maybe a decade ago, but I'm probably not up to speed with what's current. Yeah.
Okay. Don't worry. You can tweet it after this podcast. So thank you very much, Professor, for being here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I hope that you keep receiving critics that will be productive for your work. Good critics.
Let me add also that I'm always happy to talk. I don't want to be an asshole, so I'm always happy to talk to critics. I don't think I have all the answers. I believe in humble knowledge. I do prefer when critics engage in good faith. And so this particular podcast that I listened to, at least the bits I listened to, were not good faith criticisms. They weren't trying to actually figure out what my arguments were, and so they could argue with me. They were just sort of projecting things on me. But if they come to listen to your podcast, and I'm always happy to talk to people, and I'm happy to go on podcasts and disagree with people. I believe in that. I'm only trying to figure things out, and I try and figure things out by conversing with people. So good criticism is good. I very much appreciate it. But just try and actually read what I'm arguing before people argue. To do it in good faith, and try and read with a little charity can often help. But otherwise, I very much appreciate criticism. So all that is to say. Es un placer for me to be on your show, and I hope that your podcast launches well. And thank you. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk.
I'm leaving you because you said that you have another interview, isn't it?
I should go. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot, Professor. See you later. We keep in contact.
Sure. And feel free to edit out my pauses. And then I don't know if you want to edit out more or less of the race stuff. I always feel uncomfortable because people always, I'm mixed heritage, and people are always trying to identify me racially, and I always find that annoying. I don't know if you want to keep that in or keep that out, but
yeah. Don't worry. Anyway. I will revise it.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.